Today we're going to do a movement analysis of the hip region during a jumping motion, specifically examining flexion and extension of the hip joint. We're going to look at three different body segments during this jumping motion: the pelvic girdle, the hip joint, and the spine. All these body segments move along the sagittal plane and the bilateral axis during a jumping motion. We're going to split the jumping motion into two phases, a down phase and an up phase. During the down phase, the pelvic girdle is anteriorly tilted, there is flexion of the hip joint, and the spine is slightly hyperextended. During the up phase, the pelvic girdle is posteriorly tilted, the hip joint has extension, and the spine is completely extended. It is important to note that the pelvic girdle moves secondarily to the hip joint and the spine during this jumping motion. The femur also outwardly rotates during the down phase and inwardly rotates during the up phase in the jumping motion.
So now we're going to talk about the agonists or the prime movers in this jumping motion. In the two phases, there's a down phase and an up phase. In the down phase, we have concentric contraction of the hip flexors, which is the TFL, the pectineus, the iliopsoas, the rectus femoris, and the sartorius muscles. And those ones are all the concentric contractors. Now the eccentric contractions are your hip extensors in the downward phase, which are your biceps femoris, your semitendinosus, your semimembranosus, and your gluteus maximus. And then in the upward phase, all of the concentric contraction and the eccentric contraction, those ones switch. And so your eccentric contraction in the upward phase would be the hip flexors, which is the TFL, the pectineus, the iliopsoas, the rectus femoris, and the sartorius. And the concentric contractors are the hip extensors, which was the biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, the semimembranosus, and the gluteus maximus.
All right, so we just analyzed the movements of the specific body segments and also the prime movers or agonists, of the hip flexion. Now we will spend a brief moment on the spinal muscles and what they do. In the downward phase, we have concentric contraction of the erector spinae, the deep posterior muscles, and also the semispinalis. And that's in the posterior aspect. Once again, in downward phase, the spine is slightly hyperextending. And then also the eccentric contraction muscles will be the rectus abdominis, the oblique internus, and the oblique externus. And those both, the concentric and eccentric contractions, are bilaterally contracting, so at the same time on both sides of the spine. On the upward phase, the concentric, those will just switch. So the concentric muscles in the downward phase will now be eccentrically contracting, and the eccentric muscles will now be concentrically contracting for this movement.